Well, God bless everyone. Thank you for being here on this Thursday night, September 26, 2024. It's my privilege to be with you to share the word. And I tell you, it's always such a blessing to see you faithful saints join up. And we've been in a season of prayer. We have a storm that's heading up toward Nashville, and we are asking for everybody to keep that in their prayers. So we've got a great thing. We got some great word to get in tonight, and we're going to get into Genesis 14. Last week we were in Genesis 13, where God reaffirms his blessings on Abraham and his seed. And tonight we're going to look in the record in Genesis 14, where Abraham rescues Lot. And we've talked about Lot, and Lot seems to get in trouble. And we'll see what happens tonight. It's going to be a very interesting night. We're going to learn some things here, I believe. So before we get into Genesis 14, I'm going to bring up what I want you to see on my screen, because it's just so important that we have an understanding of the geography of the Middle East. It's very helpful. And I'm going to get this ready to go. And here it is. So let's turn to Genesis 14. And then I'm going to come back to this maps, but we're going to Genesis 14:1. It says, now in the days of Amraphel, the king of Shinar, Arioch, the king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and Tidal, the king of Goem, they made war. So let's for in the next verse. So let's take a look at some of these places here that I just read. So the Armaphel, the king of Shinar, you can see Shinar here. So let's get the perspective here. Here's the Great Sea, and everybody recalls that is the Mediterranean. And you can see the Euphrates River going here, and you can follow that because that goes into Babylon, and we know that's where the Tower of Babel, we're pretty sure, was in that area. And if you could go down further here, you know about the Persian Gulf. Over here is Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, which looks kind of like an arrowhead pointing down. And then we have Israel. There's the Sea of Galilee there. And then here's the Dead Sea. It's also called the Salt Sea. That's in toward the southern part of Israel. Or at the time of Abraham, it wasn't called Israel, it was called Canaan. So these are the kings, and these are coming from a lot of different areas. So we've got the one king from Shinar, another one from Elazar. This is getting up there north close to Turkey. And then we got Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and he's over here. And he seems to be the ringleader. He's going to come up several times as we go through Genesis 14. And he was up here northwest. The Persian Gulf is over here. This is all Babylonia, Babylonia in this area. Assyria is up in this area. And so, those will become more important later on. Right now, uh, we don't have to get into them. There's going to be several wars and stuff with these empires down the road. Now, the king of Goyim, sometimes it's spelled Goiim, was a Hittite. And he was up here, I think this is in the Turkey area. And we're believing that this could be really a huge army. And they're going to travel some miles down here. So go back to verse 2 here. And they made war with Bera, the king of Sodom, and Bersha, the king of Gomorrah, and Snedab, the king of Adam, and Shemeber, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, who will remain nameless. We don't know who he is, but Bela is also called Zoar. And you recall when Lot, and we'll get down to in this in the next few chapters, when Lot was escaping Sodom, one of his first places to go was the town of Zoar. These are all these all join together in the plain of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. So let's go back to our maps and we'll get more perspective here. I've got several maps that, I'm sorry, this one is a little bit small, but I found a way to make it a little bit bigger. Even though this is an editing window, it still makes it bigger. And I think it's a little bit easier to see. And you've got these kingdoms here. You've got Elam and the different kingdoms. And there's not a whole lot. We're going to talk about Akkad later on. That's going to come up. So this is just give you another perspective. So you can see, here's the Persian Gulf, and Elam's going to come up. We've already brought him up. This is a large area. And so you get an idea of the Hittites are up in this area, and just a little extra perspective there that's kind of helpful. Let's go back, and I've got another map here. This shows another perspective. This looks more like a satellite map. There's Elam, which is way close to the Persian Gulf, and Shinar, and there's the Euphrates and Elazar, and this is Haran. This is where Abraham spent 5 years waiting while his father was passing. And so these are the guys, again, this is just another map. Perspectives, I think, are very good. And let me just do one more. And again, you can see Shinar here, Persian Gulf, and Elazar, and there's Oyam, we saw it before. Sometimes they don't always agree exactly where these guys are, but this is the Arabian Desert down here. So usually when they travel, they don't travel straight across because it's a long way without much water or food. So they like to stay up in the Fertile Crescent, they call it, and then come down. And so that's what's going to happen. They're going to meet down here. So the next, we're also talking about this next map will show where they're meeting, the Valley of Shinar. Now, here is an old map that you've seen a lot of, which we'll come back to later. This is the map I'm really after right now. This is the map out of Bill Schlegel's atlas map, satellite atlas. But what I'm wanting you to see here on this one, this is the Great Salt Sea, the Dead Sea, which is 1,380 feet below sea level. And Doug and Gail and Carolyn and I and others who've been over there swam in that, or at least saw it. I swam in it. And then we have what's called here, it's kind of a shallow area. And this area here was at one time the valley we're talking about. I forget the name of it. What was the name of that valley? The plain of Siddim. So these 5 kings came down from the Mesopotamia area, and some of them were probably smaller cities, maybe not countries, and they came to the plain of Siddim, which is located on the south side of the Dead Sea. This is now a shallow area of the Dead Sea. They're saying maybe 20 or 30 feet deep now. And there's a peninsula, there's a bridge here that goes around it and that you can cross it here. And then so Zohar, it's spelled a little bit differently, but we were talking about that, right? And then Sodom and Gomorrah, this is Mount Sodom. They don't know for exactly sure where those 2 cities are, but it seems like they were down here because this was the plain of Siddim before it was covered with water. And the guess is that this area sank after the destruction or during the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. That this time was a fertile field. This is the area that, there's no way Lot would have chose this as prime real estate when Abraham gave him the option. Who wants to have a salt sea there? But at one time, this was lush and grassy. And after Sodom and Gomorrah, it sunk. And a lot of the salt water is now there. It became a plain. Now, it's kind of interesting, the word plain in the Bible. When we were in the Holy Lands, there was an area called Jezreel, the plain of Jezreel, which, Elijah and a bunch of other famous Old Testament people were there. but it's actually a wide valley. And when you have a valley that's maybe 5 feet wide or wider, it's not uncommon in the Bible for that to be called a plain. In this country, valleys are usually between two mountain ranges. But anyhow, it's not that significant. But Siddim was a plain, and at one time it was lush. and now it's covered in salt water. So let's go on back to Genesis 14:4. I think we're about ready for that. So all these kings joined together in this plain of Siddim, which you now have a good perspective. It's just south of the Salt Sea. And they served Chedorlaomer for 12 years. So he was the top dog, as I brought up earlier. He was the big guy, and we know where he was. I showed you out of the area there on the north side of Babylon where he was. And in the 13th year, they rebelled. So they didn't like serving him. Well, serving, what does that mean? That usually means taxation of some sort. The northern kings formed a coalition, and they decided to that attacked. It seems that he may have been an instigator of the group. It doesn't specify how they served him, but it's probably with payments like livestock and other, gold and whatever they had. And we should note that Lot would have been part of the subjugation because, as we learned in previous chapters, he tented near Sodom. And so King Bera was the king of Sodom. And so he probably was getting taxed and hit up by these guys too. So I wanted to mention the Transjordan. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. You'll hear it come up, and it's a very common term. Let me go back to this other map here. It's a little bit, whoops. I'm showing you everything else I got in store before I want you to see it. Here's this other map. We've got, this is the Jordan and Galilee and Dead Sea. Over here is called the Transjordan, across the Jordan. So that's when you hear the terms Transjordan, you think of the east side of the Jordan River. So the 14th year, Chedorlaomer came, and the kings were with him, and so they started to go on a big battle. And the kings who were with him struck down the Rephaim and the Erteroth and the Karnaim and the Zuim in Ham and the Eminim in Shavah Kiriathaim. What's words? And the Horites in the hill country of Seir as far as El Pera, which is by the desert. We're going to look at some of these things. So the struck down, these were huge armies that were coming down from the north. And when they struck down, they struck down. Matter of fact, archaeology shows that, I'm going to stop sharing a minute. Archaeology shows that that whole area that where these battles occurred, it's for hundreds of years, all the way up until the establishment of Edom and Moab and Ammon, which is about 1300 BC, there were no permanent settlements. They just wiped them out. You couldn't find any systematic agriculture, but what you did find were Bedouins that moved around back and forth. And that was a very normal, common lifestyle back in that time. They pitched their tents, and we're going to talk about the camel hair tents, and they moved around. And the devastation of the area was cleared out of what might have been enemy tribes to Abraham. So, because when Abraham was there, he had the freedom to roam, his flocks, his sheep for pasture. So whatever was there in this area had gotten wiped out. Now, I want to just take a moment to talk about some of the people that were knocked out in this battle, which they have three names here, which are very familiar. They struck down the Rephaim in these different places. But the three things I want you to see are Rephaim, Zuzim, and Imen. Now you may have remember these because in previous teachings I talked about these not as not as often used terminology for Raphaim. And the Raphaim were always fallen ones. And we know exactly what they are. They were powerful, large, and evil beings that were unredeemably wicked. And since they were big and strong, they usually ran the place because nobody could get rid of them. They're too big and too strong. And so so Chedorlaomer and the kings were with him. They struck down the Raphaim and all these other guys. Well, good riddance, right? These are evil, unredeemed uh, Raphaim that showed up. As we know, we've talked about this. You guys are good Bible students, and you know these guys showed up after the flood of Noah in small, limited quantities. You see them here and there. You hear Goliath, and you hear a few other names, and you've got these names here. And they showed up, but they didn't last long. And there's several reasons that we talked about for that, but they did not come back like they did previous to the flood. And so there's this town Ham, and of course Ham is a very familiar name. We know of the sons of Noah, but this is not the son. It's spelled differently. This is just a city, a location here. It's the Hebrew is spelled differently than Ham, the son of Noah. And it's probably Gilead, also in the Transjordan, which would be, as you now know, to the east side of the river. Okay, let's go back and let's take a look at 6 here. I think so before. Now, Seir, at the time of Abraham, let me see here, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir as far as El Paran, which is by the desert. Now, the desert here we're looking at is west of Edom. So I'll open up a map here quickly. But by the time that later on, the Horites moved to the hill country south of the Dead Sea, that is later called Edom. But El Paran is west of Edom. So let me go back and see if I can find a map quickly. Let me see here. I think one of these are going to be better. Well, no. Edom is very near Israel. So probably this area. So Edom is down south. So we've got Moab, which is north, and down below that is Edom. And so that's where that El Paran is in the desert to the west. So we're getting down into the Negev and in the Sinai Peninsula area. And that's where Kadesh is. So let's go back to 14. We're going to have this other new city show up here in 14:7. They turned back. So they struck down all these people, and then they turned back and came to En Mispot, which is Kadesh. Now, Kadesh is way down south and struck down all the territories of the Amalekites and also the Amorites that lived in Hazazon tomorrow. So that's what's going on here. Now, let me show you. I think I have a map here that shows kind of the route these guys took. I don't see it right now. Hold on, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to see if I can find it real quickly. And I've got a map that I think is going to be helpful. Yeah, here it is. It's not a very good one, I'm sorry to say. It's the best one I could find. Sometimes you can find really good ones and sometimes not so good. So here it is. This is, let me put it on edit so maybe I can get it a little bit bigger. It's a little bit cloudy, a little bit foggy. But here is that El Paran that I just mentioned to you way down on the south area. Sorry about the blur. So the kings that came in from Babylon area, those 4 kings with Chedorlaomer, came down this direction. Now see, here's the Dead Sea and Galilee, and we're in the Transjordan area. And so they move into this direction, and then they come to El Paran, and then they come up to Kadesh Barnea, which is a desert town, but it had 4 springs. So it was a great place to stay and even to live. And just a little interesting side note that Miriam, Moses' sister, you can recall from the Exodus, she died, and Moses buried her in the town of Kadesh Barnea. And then you're going to see the retreat, and this they're going to move up on the west side of the Jordan and head back. So we'll get into that here as the record unfolds. So let's go back to Genesis. So the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Admah and the king of Zeboim and the king of Bela, which is Zor, which we know where that is, they lined up on the plain of Ziddim for the battle against them. So this is where against these Babylonian kings, and here's these southern kings, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zebulun, Bela, Zor. So that's all in that valley of Siddim that we just talked about. This is where they face off against the king of this guy, this Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and titled king of Goyim. We know where they're from now. And Amphel, the king of Shinar, and Erech, the king of Alazar, and the 4 kings against the 5. So these 4 kings show up. Now the plain of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. So they fled, and some people hid themselves in them, and the rest of them fled to the hill country. And so Chedorlaomer and his gang are, fighting the battle, and you're seeing that the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah are getting out of Dodge, right? So they left, and they're hiding in these bitumen pits. And I thought, well, what on earth? What's in a bitumen pit, right? Wouldn't you like to know? Now, we've talked about bitumen, and bitumen is what we first brought it up at the time of Noah and the gopher wood. And at that time, I was of the opinion that the bitumen was made out of tree sap. And there is a bitumen that is made out of tree sap, which is very effective waterproofer. But there's also a bitumen that bubbles out of the ground. Can you believe that? Now, it's interesting because we know that asphalt, which is a modern day deal, there was no such thing as asphalt back there, but there was bitumen. Sometimes they call them tar pits, and those were existence for quite around. They had discovered they've discovered mastodons in them. The old woolly mammoths and other things got cut up. So tar pits were very abundant around the Dead Sea area, and I'm going to show you what they look like. And it actually is known that they bubble up out of the ground. So this is what a bitumen pit looks like. It's black and it's oily. And it's leftovers from the fossils, the animal remains of Noah's flood. This is interesting that this is what occurred, but under the pressure of the water on the flood on the earth, we know that the plant life turned into coal, which was black, and that the animal life turned into tar, eventually crude oil, which we now burn, it's refined into gasoline and moved in. Now I want to show you, this is bitumen actually bubbling. You can see this big bubble. It actually bubbles out of the ground. So what do we mean when we say they were hiding in the tar pits? Well, it's kind of interesting. Did they just jump in that black mess? I don't know. I tried to research this in more depth. There are, could have been sunken areas. There are sunken areas around the Dead Sea that could have been sunken areas with tar pits in the bottom of them. And so they just jumped into these pits and hid themselves from the armies that were passing by. But anyhow, the plain down there was full of bitumen pits, which actually bubbled out of the water. And as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the people hid themselves in them, the tar pits, and the rest of them fled to the hill country. And most likely the hill country would, let me see here, would have probably been, let me see here, what side? On the east side, on the other side. And I showed you that map because the kings from Babylon came down on the west side. So they probably headed out on the east side. So after the battle, we've got that. These kings, they head out through the tar pits. And well, guess what happens when people abandon their cities? The kings came in, the invading kings come in, and they steal all the food. They go into Sodom and Gomorrah and just take all the food, take all the possessions, and went away. And guess who they took with him? Because he's hanging out in Sodom with the Sodomites, which it's kind of a curious thing for him to do, but that's what he did. So Lot was there. He had apparently moved from, as you know, he was when Abraham and Lot, Abraham said, what area do you want to take for you and your shepherds or your sheep herders and your livestock people? And he said he wanted those wonderful green grassy area there. And so he settled in that area, which was near Sodom, which is now underwater. But at that time it was lush. And then later he apparently moved in to Sodom because they took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, which makes him a nephew, who lived in Sodom. And he took all of his possessions and they went away. And so now he's been captive. So that's not going to set well with Abraham, is it? So let's take a look in verse 13. So someone escaped this battle, someone who had escaped the battle and told Abram the Hebrew. This is interesting. Don't know why, but this is the first time Hebrew is used in the Bible. So then someone who had escaped came and told Abram. Now he was living in the Oaks of Mamre. We know that, right? That's where he was before, that last place where he had his altar there. And Mamre the Amorite and the brother, remember his allies, Mamre, Eshcol, and Anar. They were all allies of Abraham. So that's where he was living. And so this escapee comes and tells him the news. And so let's take a look in verse 14. So Abraham heard that his relative, Lot, was taken captive, and he led out his trained men, and these were born in his house, 318. Well, that's a large group. This is probably from the slaves that he had brought with him from Haran and actually increased in number after he left Egypt. And they pursued him as far as Dan. So they take after this Chedorlaomer, and the guys that took all the possessions in his nephew, and they go as far as Dan. Okay, let's go back to the map. You guys are going to really know geography here, and let's go back to the map of that I want to show you here. And so, is this the one that has it? I don't see it right now. But Dan is up here north. It's way north in Dan. So we went to that on the Bible Lands tour. I'm not sure how far north, but it's up in this area. I'm sorry I don't have a map that'll show you. But they went as far as Dan, and then while we got this map open, and then some went as far as Damascus, which is way, way north of Canaan. So let's go back to here. So when Abraham heard, he let out the house that were born in his house and pursued them as far as Dan. So they take out after him. And he split up his forces against them at night, and he and his servants, and struck them down and pursued them to Hobah, which is north of Damascus, which I show there. So they ran them out of town in a long way. And a good question is 318? That sounds like a small army compared to these 4 kings or 5 kings that came in from Mesopotamia. Well, how could he have? There's several answers for that we'll consider. One, Abraham took his people, but then he also had his buddies, the allies, Amri, Ishkol, and Anar. Of course, they would have had large families and maybe, a large number of slaves, probably not near as much as Abraham because he was very wealthy. So they were allies. So they probably joined this group. And then once, what happens when you start fighting enemy forces that have taken over a lot, have conquered a lot of these towns that we just saw, a lot of these guys are going to revolt, and they're still captive with the armies of the invading forces. And so they could have easily revolted and joined Abraham and his crew to fight against Chedorlaomer. So Dan, which is a town way north, it was originally called Laish, which we were there, and later changed to Dan. And Dan is one of the 12 tribes, one of the sons of Israel, Jacob. And so it's far north up there that I mentioned. It's way far north. There's a saying that you're going to see in the Bible. It's going to say from Dan to Beersheba, something that John mentioned oftentimes in the Bible Lands Tour. And that's another way from the far north to the far south of Israel, because Beersheba, as you know, is way south and Dan is way north. So Abraham pursued Chedorlaomer and his allies as far as Dan. And the initial battle was fought, but when he retreated north, Abraham and his allies pursued them as far as Damascus, which is about 45 miles north of Dan. Let's go back to Genesis 14 here and in verse 15. He split up his forces against them, he and his servants, and struck them down and pursued them to Hobah, which we haven't found any architectural remains. We don't know where that's at. But it's estimated that's about 45 miles north of Damascus. I'm not sure how they know that, but that's what they're saying. So that's way north. And so Abram, brought back all the possessions, and he also brought back his relative Lot and his possessions and all the women. Now, you notice it talks about women here. It's kind of interesting that it does this, because when you have a battle, the fighting men oftentimes are killed or captured. So Lot comes back with the women and the people, and the people will most likely boys and older men that weren't fighting the battle that survived it. So Abraham won the war and brought back his nephew Lot and his possessions. And this is another record where Abraham helps Lot, and his helping is not over, as we're going to see in future chapters. So that's how, as far as we're going to go tonight. I'll stop sharing here. And next week, we're going to go into the latter part of this chapter. We're going to get into Melchizedek, which is a very famous name in the Old Testament and the New. Very famous, a priest. He's not the priest, but a priest. There are lots of priests in those times. And we're going to see how he deals with the king of Sodom. Heavenly Father, Lord Jesus Christ, thank you for your love and your patience with us. Thank you for your word and how interesting it is to see how Abraham fought for his family. Like Nehemiah, he exhorted the people of Israel, fight for your family, your loved ones. And it was always been the way you've set it up. We take care of our families. We're especially good to the household of faith, our extended family, and we're so thankful that you've given us. And we do that. We pray to help each other out. Tonight, we've asked for your prayers to be heard regarding all of the stuff going on with the hurricane. Bless this group tonight. Keep them at rest. Thank you for us being together and your love for all of us and being able to read the word and make it alive again. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.